So I hope you all liked the video from Wouter. It was recorded beforehand, so he's now live here to answer questions and build on his perspectives. Before I explain the setup of the session, I'll introduce myself, and then Wouter can give some further introduction to himself. So my name is Arjan Keizer. I'm based in the Netherlands. I'm an e-mobility expert working at Shell Fleet Solutions, where I joined in 2021. Before that, I actually joined the Shell Group in 2018, joining New Motion, which is a scale-up in e-mobility solutions for home and office and on the go, and was acquired by Shell 1 year before I joined them. In my current role, I'm selling decarbonization solutions to international companies in the sector industry and fast-moving consumer goods, like bottlers and supermarkets. And that includes selling EV for cars and trucks, but also renewable diesel and bioenergy. So really at the forefront of decarbonization. I'm also an accelerator for climate action, both within Shell as well as externally on LinkedIn. And I try to build bridges between activists and the fossil industry, as I believe that both can learn from each other. Within Shell, I'm the chairman of the Future Energy Leaders community in the Netherlands, and also closely involved with the global board, representing 5,500 people within Shell that have a keen interest to learn more about the energy transition. And in this session, I will share my personal views. So Wouter, what do you want to add from your history? I think you have a very long and strong CV. What do you want people to know beyond the Club of Rome, where you have obviously been part of?
I cannot cover all 60 years that I am involved in all this. We were very young editors. I was science editor at Dutch television when I encountered the people who wrote Limits to Growth by the Club of Rome. It was the late 1970. And out of that grew an enormous system of sustainability, science, advisory, filming, talking, whatever. And especially, I took all kinds of initiatives in the course of the years, and we started. I was about the few who started the first renewable energy developments. I've been engaged with both the NGOs in the world, governments, and big industry. And at Shell, I commenced at around 83. With the first talks where we tried to convince the Shell management that they should become an energy company rather than only an oil and gas company. That is a long time ago. I was involved in several conflict resolutions between industry and NGOs and whatever. Some were very successful and others were very difficult. But nevertheless, I have 50 years of experience in energy, environment, climate, and resources.
Thank you for that introduction. Then I will start to explain the setup of this session. So we have prepared a couple of statements that will present it as a poll, and you can vote. Please look at all the answers, and then don't forget to press submit. You will then also see what other people voted, and then Wouter and I will reflect on the outcomes. You can also write questions or your personal opinion in the chat, which we will include in the reflections on the topic. And after 5 to 10 minutes per reflection, we'll move on to the next statement. And the session is scheduled until 15:15, so about 35 minutes from now. But if needed, we can continue slightly longer, but let's see how interactive it will be. I will now share the first poll. And the question is as follows. It's about limits to growth. And the statement is, I am concerned that our current society and lifestyle will face limits to growth. So do you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree, or are unsure? Please answer the question or result that best fits with your position. So I see the first votes coming in. Mostly strongly agree or agree. No disagreement at this stage. And I think, that's also what I personally see. So the carbon budget for 1.5 degree global warming is depleted in 2030 at the current rate. And oil and gas consumption actually continues rising at the global level. And the reduction in Europe is relatively small compared to the growth in emerging economies. So with sea level rise, as Hans van der Loo yesterday alluded to, extreme weather and tipping points accelerating all of the above, I think there is serious need to start reducing global emissions as per the IPCC recommendations. And it seems logical to limit the growth of sectors like aviation, the meat industry, fast fashion, and electronics, or at least prevent the unnecessary use by incorporating external effects in the price. So the proceeds, like carbon pricing, can be used to invest in green alternatives and a just transition. And even if we may innovate in green alternatives and reduce the green premium, as Bill Gates calls it, we would still jeopardize the other planetary boundaries. So it's not only about CO2, it's also about resources, as has been shared. I think what people that I sometimes talk to that disagree mention is that basically the human expectation is often exceeded when we talk about innovation. So in 2000, we would probably not have expected the current use of the iPhone, the electric cars, and the scale of solar PV. And at the same time, I think Wouter mentioned it in his speech, the Jevons paradox means that the cars have grown in size and thereby have undone the efficiency gains. So that makes it difficult to continue growing without any limit. And of course, economic growth is very important in our current capitalist system. And also the healthy P&L of countries is required to invest in innovation. So that might be arguments why growth is required. But very curious to learn about what your view is on this. And then in the meantime, I will read the chat and see what the public is saying.
So what do you want me to do? React on these statements that come in now?
Yeah, what's your view on limits to growth? Do you think that some form of degrowth may be required?
Well, when we published Limits to Growth, I was involved in this Club of Rome endeavor from the beginning, and it created an enormous uproar in the whole world because people could not imagine what it would look like. But the scenarios, the basic scenario tells us that by the mid of this century, we enter a period which is called overshoot and collapse. And the resources are no longer available in sufficient quantities. Pollution will grow like crazy in terms of global warming and waste and squander. And population growth will decline because there will not be any food. That's the basic scenario. And ever since, we've done hundreds of repeats of these calculations, and the outcome is still the same. The last one is from 2022. It's done by institutes, industry, universities. So the calculations tell us the limits are there, and they appear every day in all kinds of signals that we see around us. So limits to growth are there. There's no doubt, and there's no question.
I think there is one question from Martijn Hoijmaier. He says, can you please define growth? Because he says we need to grow in recycling, in renewables, and so on, but we need to reduce oil and gas and other polluting industries. And I think growth is about the economy, the lifestyle. And I think, if you read to, for example, the speech from Hans van der Loo, he's saying that we cannot replace everything by green growth and renewables, because recycling is limited. The material ores are becoming less efficient, as you also mentioned, Wouter. So to continue this society that we have today is possible, or is difficult, even if we grow in recycling and renewables.
It's also the word growth is also a semantic problem, because GDP growth, as we know it, has the advantage that it counts for production and consumption that we can tell, but then the waste and squander is not involved. It's considered in the GDP as growth, as additional value, whereas it's the opposite. That's where the problem is. You need, in order to get welfare, wealth for another billion or perhaps 2 billion people, you need stuff, and the stuff has to be produced. And recycling is hardly available, as Van der Loo has made it very clear. So whatever happens, we will run out of resources and possibilities. So there has to be another instrument. Growth in itself is not a point. It's a matter of the definition. You don't want the waste and the trouble and the destruction, but you want the stuff. Otherwise, people cannot live, cannot have a roof on their house, have no food.
Yeah. I'm also reading Peter Dasbach. He's saying, I wonder whether we should continue to have things for free because there is no free lunch. And I personally agree strongly. I think the external effects like emissions and detrimental effect to biodiversity do need to be incorporated. And that's also a challenge for green alternatives because fossil fuels are so cheap. And especially if you look like something like kerosene where there is no tax upon, then it's hard to compete with green alternatives. And right now, I think, Wouter, as you mentioned, people started lighting the skies because basically there is no cost associated that impacts the buyer. Well, actually, the cost for society is significantly there. So that free lunch doesn't exist. And if we do care about the future of our children, grandchildren, then it is hard to see that world without paying for those externalities.
We have tried already from the beginnings. The whole story about degrowth and whatever is not new. In 1995, I was the editor of a Club of Rome report about the sustainable GDP, where we omit all the externalities or make them part of pricing, or where we invent growth possibilities with a lesser impact on the environment. So it's an old story. And the decoupling between energy growth on the one hand and economic growth on the other hand, the decoupling is not successful. It is the idea, it is the plan, but the rebound effects, as you just said about cars getting bigger and bigger, that the rebound effect is always there. When air traffic became more inexpensive, in the old days, we did fly business class around the globe for Shell and for Unilever and for World Wildlife Fund. And it was very expensive. And economy class hardly existed. Now we have a few thousand more airfields in the world and airplanes that can get anywhere. And it's so cheap, it's almost too cheap to meter. So there is the problem. The volume there has to be reduced, and you can only do so by price mechanisms. There's no other methodology available. But politicians who try to bring that forward won't live long in their seats, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
If you say, sorry, consumers, you have to pay 4 times or 10 times more, then of course that's the end. We are facing all the time these difficulties that things have to be moved, things have to change, but the public at large wants more welfare stuff and so on. And that has to end, and it will end in a clash. There's no doubt.
I think the last comment I like to call out is from Hans, who's stating that it's about well-being and not welfare. And I think that's very important. Like the economic growth in itself shouldn't be a goal. Of course, it's correlated.
Sorry, Arjan, I interrupt you. Wealth and welfare are not different. It's the same. Everything we do has a wealth and welfare component. And you cannot replace wealth with welfare and say, no, we have an economy without material stuff. The well-being economy is full of stuff. It's the same as wealth. It's perhaps the only thing that's not there is greed. But think of the billions of people who have no wealth at all, who hardly have a house. So well-being economy is a toy of spoiled Western children and pubers, and forget it.
Well, I think I agree, Wouter, with the fact that at the beginning, when GDP is low, there is a strong correlation, but at some point it basically plateaus or even declines. And I think that's where maybe limits to growth actually should be priced more. I'd like to move on to the next question because we have quite a few statements prepared, and that zooms in on the complexity of the transition. So the statement is as follows. The energy transition is so complex that only few people really understand it well enough. And I think, Wouter, you mentioned in your speech about 500 to 1,000 people might actually understand the complexity. So what do people see? Please choose an answer that best fits your opinion, and then we will reflect on it.
Yeah, it's a statement made by Hans van der Loo, who got it, I believe, from Janowicz, who said, what was his name in Brussels. And I agree. We come across hundreds of thousands of people who are concerned with the energy transition, but they keep making the mistakes all the time. There was a report 2 weeks ago by a Norwegian or Swedish agency who said that stated that the renewables are far better in terms of energy and intensity than oil and gas. Think of that. And it's a formal engineering firm making that sort of crazy statements. And it's full of that. I meet with hundreds of climate activists, energy activists, wonderful people, full of sorrow, full of sadness because they fear the future, but they don't know. The trouble is they don't understand the complexity. The whole system is so complex that about 25 years ago, a famous philosopher whose name I've just lost, wrote in a book, we are entering the very moment that complexity runs out of our hands. And the day he positioned, the day of that explosion, so to speak, he defined it as midnight, and it has occurred in the middle of the year 2000. After midnight, we are no longer able to understand the full complexity, because the world has created an enormous interdependency of all sorts of, and that is almost impossible to govern unless you have a big office somewhere in the clouds in the sky where somebody rules as a conductor the whole orchestra of the world. But that orchestra is not available and the conductor is not there. The complexity
if I look at the poll, people tend to agree with your answer, and I think my personal answer is also in that state. So 10 people, or the majority, saying agree, then quite a few agree, and then almost no one disagreeing or strongly disagreeing. I think it's fair because the energy transition not only includes knowledge about the climate, but also about our energy system, geopolitics, resource availability, supply chains, economics, politics. So there's so much to grasp. And I think there's only a few people out there with an academic degree or working experience in 2 or more of these fields, and probably rare for people to have experience in more than 4 of those areas.
I give you an example, Arjan. Exponentiality is the key of the mathematics in limits to growth, and also the sequential world models that came after, including World 7, which is our most recent model. It's full of exponentialities. If you calculate the proper exponentialities, if you calculate them properly, you enter something very strange, the total paradox of that sort of system thinking against econometrics. Econometrics is a linear sort of calculating, and they say today we have 2 and tomorrow we have 10 and then we have 20, 30. If you don't interact all these variables with each other, then you run in a total nonsensical system. I give you one example. At 3 or 6% economic growth, the Chinese trade all the way from China to Western Europe will completely be blocked by means of traffic jams between Malaysia and the Suez Canal. A traffic jam that will last 6 months with container ships. Have you ever thought of it, you economist? No, he has no idea. And then he tells us that there will be some innovation to solve that. Possibly 1,000 trains a day all across Asia. Think of that.
Very, very interesting. I'm personally really looking for experts in this space who try to basically match the fossil and energy world with the more activist worlds of the urgency of climate change. And I think there is a few examples out there like Simon Michaud, Nate Higgins has a great podcast where he invites thought leaders, people like Michael Liebrecht, Jeremy Bentham, who is also part of this conference, Jean-Marc Jancovici. But I think the actual expertise is hard to find. And I think if you look at more CEOs and business leaders, they often have other priorities. So they can invest only a small portion of their time to actually learn. And of course, they have access to great consultants, institutions, etc. But they do need to have the time and the personal buy-in. So people like Emmanuel Faber, Bill Gates, Paul Polman are probably more rare, but hopefully that will change soon.
Yeah, but they make terrible mistakes. I'm not going to tell you where in their books the mistakes are, but they are there, I can assure you.
Definitely. So I think no one is perfect, indeed.
No.
I'm just reading up on the chat. So let me see what people are stating here. There was one question that we skipped earlier, but maybe it resonates here also about the complexity. So the role of the Netherlands, is that an illusion that the Netherlands can play a strong role, or is it actually something where Netherlands can stand out?
The Dutch are think of themselves as some very unique people, but I disagree. We are a part of. In my most cynical moments, I tell my audiences that we are a part of the German Federal Republic, and we are the only monarchy in the German Federal Republic. That's why we're so popular, because they love kings and queens and emperors. But we are a small nation. We have no resources. We have gas, natural gas, but we may not use it for reasons which I think are stupid and wrong, very wrong. For environmental reasons and for earthquake reasons, but it's wrong. You have to use it. It's an enormous treasure, and it's there, and it's relatively much better than all the alternatives now in development. So here we make a tremendous mistake. Then they are now constructing all kinds of hydrogen pipelines, and they become completely hypnotized by the future option of hydrogen, which is only a very small fraction of the energy and climate problem. And the Netherlands are so small, whatever we do, it has no effect on climate change at all. And in the meantime, we create an enormous conflict in society, polarization between the extreme right and the extreme idealistic left. The polarization will grow and grow and grow, and you see the last elections of last week. It's a disaster. We are close to a Trump sort of era. How can a Trump country become a front runner in the world if we become a Trump country? And that part of the extreme right dislikes everything that's considered in our circles regarding climate and energy and resources. They refuse it. They are against it. They don't want to learn. So how can you be a front runner? And our industry has very little vision on about what is needed in the future. We try to align them, but they lag behind. And especially the fossil fuel industry is far too silent. It has
I think that's a nice segue, Wouter, to the next poll, which is actually about the role for the fossil industry. So let's also get the opinion of the public, and then you can continue your vision about the fossil industry. So the statement is as follows. The energy transition requires all parties to contribute, including energy companies with a fossil background. So do you agree or disagree, and to what extent? And feel free to add your opinion or questions in the chat. Maybe a quick personal reflection on this. I actually think that a transition from one energy system into a new one is really complex. And then it's good to use the expertise of the current incumbents that have a good understanding and the relationship with governments, with geopolitics, etc. At the same time, of course, we should recognize they have vested interests, and not all strengths that they bring from the fossil world are relevant in a more ambiguous, innovative, decentralized transition for renewables. But I think green molecules are a clear strength, like hydrogen, biofuels, biochemicals, and also the proceeds that they make from fossil fuel can be used to invest, and I think has to be used to invest in renewables. And I'm very curious to see your view about it.
Well, we talked about complexity, and we leave lots of the energy transition in the hands of the laymen people, amateurs. I like the democracy of it, which is beautiful, that people take care and people take care of their own environment and their energy supply, but it's a very small fraction. it's not so that 20-30% of the people of the population likes or understands the energy transition. There has to be expertise, and we don't talk about fossil expertise. We talk about the laws of physics, chemistry, electronics, because that's what counts. And if you apply these laws, then you can be sure that in the laboratories, well equipped, well combined, the inventions will be there. And the layman cannot do it. So you need the expertise, and for God's sake, we have assembled all the expertise in some universities in our country, but also in the whole world. Some universities who are excellent in terms of electronics, and physics, and chemistry, and that's where you have to be. So what does it matter whether you have a head with Shell or Eneco of whatever? If you're a smart physicist, a smart engineer, please be with us.
I see that most people agree with that view, Wouter. I think the majority strongly agrees that oil and gas companies can have a great role by their expertise and funds, and quite a few people also agreeing.
But there's something I want to add to this. I have seen certain cowardness within the oil and gas industry over the last 10, 20 years. And in conversations with them, with the top, they say, yeah, because this is a risk and that's a risk, and I'm personally attacked and all that. Okay, yes, you have to have courage. And you should not leave the courage to people like us who dare to stand out in the open and we are attacked. Anonymous telephones because we say the wrong things about climate and energy. Although I'm the founder of the environmental movement, I am being attacked. And behind me, Shells and the Totals of this world hide themselves behind a tree because they are too afraid to speak out in the open. When does that stop? When do you start to take responsibility for energy security and for the courage that we need to make this happen, all of this? When is it there?
I think it's a great point, Wouter. I think, of course, it starts with the commitment to net zero that many oil and gas companies have made. I think they do underwrite the importance of climate change,
yes,
but they have an opportunity to be much more vocal about it. And that would also help to remove the deniers of climate change an argument, because if Extinction Rebellion is having a protest, people don't want to listen to it. But I think if a company like Shell, BP, actively states, hey, we are very concerned about the urgency of the energy transition, so we want everyone to collaborate and we need governments to take their ownership, and then we can invest and then it will be profitable for us. That's a very different position. And then, of course, you can argue, does it always need to be profitable in the short term or not? I think that's something for the shareholders also to take a responsibility in. But I do see that everyone needs to step up. So I think it's not only the oil and gas industry, it's also the shareholders and the politicians.
No, but listen, that's not what I'm saying. Where are the new future scenarios? In Shell, we have worked on future scenarios since decades. I was involved there as an advisor or counsel, I don't remember, but it was full of intellect and fun and imagination. Now there is a new era. There is now a new time, and in those new times, we need the next scenarios. We have challenged friends of mine close to Shell, close to the environmental defense organizations. We have proposed over the last 2 or 3 years, make the new scenarios, but the industry does not. There is no scenario for the Dutch industry, neither for the German industry. More in the Scandinavian industry, they have better future scenarios, but here they are missing. Whereas in my NGO circles, the friends there, Agenda and so on, they have a future scenario. Why don't you have a future scenario? The future is grim. There won't be enough in terms of resources and materials to make the whole transition, to make it a success. It's not there. And it needs the best of brains and brilliance and money and investments to understand that. Otherwise, we run against the brick wall, and it's dangerous.
I think it's very dangerous, and it might actually be happening at this moment. I think it will be interesting to see at COP28 what commitments governments and companies come up with. But yeah, definitely see the urgency and the opportunity about it that this brings. I see one question about from Nick Allen about do you see any route to creating broad societal support for change, which then gives governments legitimacy to act together? Or is it doomed to be rooted through conflict? And in the meantime, I will open up the poll where we ask about the role for the governments.
Do you want me to answer?
Yes, please.
Okay. When we started with Limits to Growth in 1970, I made an interview for Dutch television and German television with the founder of the Club of Rome World Model number 3, which was Jay Forrester. And Forrester is the founder also of Industry Dynamics. And he, in that interview, we talked about the basic scenario: overshoot and collapse by 2050. And Forrester made a famous statement that you can find all over the internet. He said, the world has seen growth for the last 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 years. That growth is going to stop. And it will stop, and it has to stop. The only question is how. Will it be by compromise, by consensus, by peace, by treaties, or will it be by conflict and war? That is the basic question. If you run against a brick wall, and we will face a fight between the continents, between all kinds of countries, fighting for the last resources and the last fresh water to run your hydropower or your nuclear power or your coal power station, the water won't be there, or it's not enough, or it's too hot, or it's out of place. So that is a catastrophe. War and conflict, or consensus and compromises and understanding. And for the last thing, we need the initiative by companies, by industry, because that's where you have the ability to organize. It's extremely clever that companies, international companies, manage to get the last drop of oil to the last island in the world. That is a logistic miracle. So use all that miraculous thought and power and intelligence to move to the next subject.
Yeah, I think a very interesting perspective, Wouter. And probably one of the issues, of course, is what you just shared in the previous topic still about the scenarios that you would expect from the industry at Dutch level, German level, and at country level. Because I think that's the vision that you need to have where you're heading to, because at this moment on short term, climate change is visible, but it's not actually impacting us. The Netherlands will flood if the sea level rises with more than 2 meters, which now is actually something that is not unimaginable by the end of this decade. But people don't see that today. And that's also why maybe politicians actually do need to take a role, because they are the only ones that can act. Society will not have that outlook early on. Based on the poll, actually, it's interesting to see that many people say that a crisis approach even would be required, like Pearl Harbor in US or COVID-19 a couple of years ago, where actually the governments take the ownership and set the objectives. What's your view on that, Wouter? When would that be required, or should we prevent by acting swiftly now and then just stay underneath that crisis approach?
If you use the examples of COVID and Pearl Harbor, then for your audience, Pearl Harbor, a month after the bombardment, Roosevelt called his industry people together, and he said, "Gentlemen, I want a few 100,000 ships and planes and whatever, and in 2 years, because the world is in danger." And the industry people said, "We cannot do that, Mr. President, because we have to construct our ports." And he said, "No, you're only going to manufacture what I want. I will be paid." So, and why was it possible? And they delivered. All those hundreds of thousands of ships and tanks and whatever, they were constructed in 2 years' time. And it was because there was one leader. So leadership is the key. And in COVID, luckily, we all obeyed the laws of medicine and health, and governments had to take responsibility. That was, of course, not a job for the industry. So there are examples of worldwide cooperation under leadership, but also under consensus. And please realize that we do have international treaties. Many of them are the product of cooperation, normalization of air traffic, of electronics, electricity, whatever. The whole world is full of agreements organized at world level. So we do have the instruments somewhere. They are there.
Achim Hofman is asking at what level politicians will need to act. So he says, this is a global fight, so who will set the thermostats?
Say that again?
Who will set the thermostat for the temperature at the world and therefore the consequences? So which global body might have an influence on that?
Are you talking about the temperature, to set the temperature?
Yeah, so who could set the thermostat? So is it the IPCC, of course, gives recommendations and gives warnings, but they have no mandate. The United Nations have some power, but in the end, individual states can veto actions.
It's a matter of authority and hierarchy, and we have certain hierarchies available, like the World Meteorological Society, the World Physics Society, the World Trade Organization. If they join hands, there are about 25 of those. If those join hands and agree together at the World Economic Forum or wherever, or in the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, they can, together with all the NGOs and with all the institutes and the Red Cross Search Organization, set the temperature. This is where we have to head for. We are heading now for more than 2 or 3 degrees. And you need the combined hierarchy and authorities to set the time and set the temperature and the thermometer in the right sort of place. Combined.
Yeah. I think one interesting comment from Hans is saying that many of the international oil companies are low-lying areas. So he would hope that the risk of sea level rise gets better understood, that it could become a common rallying cause. And although it will also trigger another race for energy and resources to move higher up. So I think interesting to see where that will head us. I will start the last question or the last statement, and it's about education. And we're also nearing a quarter past the hour. So the statement is as follows. There should be much more emphasis on education at schools and universities, including mandatory knowledge levels.
Yeah, okay. Well, that is a very strange sort of point, because of course we need education, but who educates the educators? We keep seeing all the time that in schools and universities and wherever you go, the wrong things are being told. And that's because the situation is so complex. Next is that if you start to teach little children that the world goes under within their lifetime, that's not a very good idea. Should do that. So education is not a panacea, it's something to be handled very carefully. Who educates the educators? Be careful with children. And of course, then there is the trouble that if you don't, if you try to educate, and 70 million Europeans are now illiterate, and 25% of the European population is can read but not understand, like Mr. Trump, that sort of brain, whereas no, it's not the brain, but whatever there is. And so they can read but not understand, and the illiterates cannot understand and read at all. So where do you start if education is so much on the decline? We used to be an emancipated society with a splendid educational system, and now half a century later we have such enormous amounts of people who cannot read and understand anymore. So where do you start with education? Of course, it's key to everything. If people don't understand, then we go under anyway.
I think you bring up a fair challenge at the same time. I think with artificial intelligence and online learning mechanism, it shouldn't also be that difficult to set up a training course where maybe you don't need to educate the educators and you can discuss it at more central level. Of course, there will still be a role of the educators because they need to reflect, but that might be less complex. I'm also wondering to what extent.
Arjan, I've been a teacher and a professor as a sidekick, one of my jobs over all these decades. And my learning is, of course, that if you don't interact with your students and your pupils directly without a screen, things don't work. The teacher is the elder who the youngsters since thousands of years listen to. And it's not that I, in my age, still want to be listened to. I can be a voice in the desert. That's okay with me. But you need a direct contact if you want to educate the people and the public. You need a direct contact, and not and think that AI will solve that issue. It's a wonderful tool. I've seen some of the miracles over the last few weeks, and it's wonderful. Very, very challenging, and lots of fun. But let's face the fact that education, as we tried it with the NGOs and all sorts of institutes, has largely failed over the last decades. People don't follow the subject anymore.
I'm also curious to what extent it is about education and business interest, because I think there is also other reasons why maybe even if you would understand it, you would still not act accordingly. But I think as Hans is also writing, at least better education would neutralize some extremist governments and extremist views, because there is more knowledge available and a better discussion can be had.
Definitely, yeah. And I would love to have a specialist educational institution. I would love to have it. It would be excellent if we could have that.
I think Nick Allen is saying that in his view, education needs to involve what it means to me and and my family, to make it personal, because that's when even some CEOs are being converted if they get questions from their children about their grandchildren's future, and then suddenly it ticks, or they do get that motivation. Of course, not saying that that's the biggest bottleneck right now, because I think in the Netherlands, Germany, UK, we actually see quite a bit of realization in that sense, but at a global level, there's still a way to go. With that, I actually want to leave it to the closing remarks, Wouter, because we are a couple minutes past the scheduled time. So is there any final statement or opinion you want to share?
Well, I see here a last question by Anouk Bouwhuis. How can we prevent earthquakes in Groningen? I suppose that in your conference you have a place for Margriet Kuiper, who has all the answers to stabilize the soil. So that's possible to do that properly. My final statement is that the subject of the resource scarcity should be stressed and emphasized. I mean, that is a key element, and people tend to forget it and do not understand it. The resources are not always available, and its traditional geologist's view is that the Earth is a thick piece of iron, and so endlessly we can benefit from all that iron and the thick Earth crust. That's not true. It will be terrible.
Thanks, Wouter. With that, I want to thank everyone who participated in this session. And definitely Margriet will speak later this afternoon about CCS. Also very keen to learn about that, as well as carbon takeback obligation, and also other sessions. And I still need to listen a few back that have been finished. I think final remark on knowledge. I think personally, for me, the realization only came a year ago. Well, I've been working on the energy transition for 5 years. So I didn't know about the resource constraints that we're facing, the other biodiversity and planetary boundaries. So I think education is important, and it will help to set one's passion, but it's not the key topic. But every small gain needs to be done, and courage is very important. So Thanks, Wouter, and thanks everyone. And I will send you back to the lobby for the other sessions.
Okay.